Japan by River Cruise is made possible thanks to those who donate to the show at japanbyrivercruise.com and due to the generosity of our corporate sponsors. This week's show is brought to you by Family Mart Socks.
Family Mart Socks. Why? Because we've been in a pandemic for almost 2 years and honestly we're starting to lose it. Just let us have this. Hello, Brian, and welcome back to Japan by River Cruise. I'm Bobby Judo.
And I'm Ollie Horn.
And joining us this week is Hiromu Nagahara. Hiromu is an associate professor of modern Japanese history at MIT and the author of Tokyo Boogie Woogie, Japan's pop era and its discontents. He's also the faculty advisor to an MIT student club that's developing nuclear fusion-powered river cruise boats as part of a very elaborate prank on Harvard and Yale. Hiromu, thanks for being here.
It's a real pleasure to be here.
On this week's show, we'll talk to Hiromu about tumultuous times for the Japanese imperial family, including Princess Mako's upcoming move to the US with her new husband. We reached out to both Princess Mako and Oprah Winfrey to see if we could expect another bombshell royal interview, but unfortunately both sides responded by saying, "Who?" Plus, Ollie's got your weekly river cruise recommendation. Ollie?
Yes, Bobby, this week's recommendation is a new startup cruise liner run by French transport conglomerate SNCF that promises to treat its customers like royalty. Given what I know about how they treated their royals in the late 1700s, I've sought urgent clarification on what they mean by that before I'm able to recommend it.
And we'll talk to a recycling-focused river cruise company who's planning a special limited edition autumn run on a man-made river created exclusively out of all the pumpkin spice lattes that will be left over when y'all remember that they suck. I'm legit upset that we had to talk about pumpkin spice lattes and socks in this episode.
Twitter, you did this.
But first, Soap Talk.
Brian, anything to add this week before we get started?
No.
Okay. Bobby.
Yes.
You're a YouTuber again.
Yeah, I just put up a video introducing what I'm planning on doing with my channel. I'm getting back into video production and remembering why I got out of it. It takes a long time, and it's really hard.
It takes forever.
With a podcast, all you have to do is record audio and then get someone to edit it for you.
Yeah, it couldn't be easier for you, could it? So, I mean, you've just spent the introduction dicking on people that have gone mad and bought Family Mart socks. Your version of the pandemic breakdown is reopening your YouTube channel.
Well, this is
why has it taken you 2 years?
This is something I do periodically. Every time I start to get financially insecure, I go, maybe I can get something from YouTube again. But no, I've got I spent some of the pandemic working on kind of like a pseudo memoir of some of my experiences in the entertainment industry here, and I had a bunch of good stories from there, and stories that I don't get to share at the podcast because someone doesn't let me talk. So I thought that might be a good place to share kind of some of those stories.
So what you're actually saying is you don't get enough airtime on this show, so you've had to start a whole new YouTube channel.
Basically, yeah. Speaking of not letting people talk, Hiromu, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're joining us from Boston. So you're an associate professor of modern Japanese history. I would love to get some Japanese history study recommendations. I've literally got the Samson books on my shelf, and also Modern Japanese History by Gordon. And I've tried so hard to read them, and I can never make it through.
What other books can gather dust on Bobby's shelf, please?
You got some classics there. Sansom is really, I mean, that's the original Sansom, right? From the British diplomat who was in Japan in Meiji era. Something that I think has been going around the internet, it's been really popular. I've really enjoyed it. Is a book by a colleague of mine named Amy Stanley. It's a book called Stranger in the Shogun City. It's about a otherwise obscure provincial woman in the Edo period in the first half of the 1800s, who is born as a daughter of a temple priest, so a little bit well educated, but not super well off. And Amy Stanley, who's a professor of early modern Japanese history at Northwestern, found a stash of letters between her and her family throughout the course of her life. And
so this is this isn't historical fiction. This is a real woman.
It's not a historical fiction, but Amy writes it so well that it reads really nicely. And so no, it's based on primary sources. It's based on actual historical sources. Amy is a top-notch scholar, but it paints this really vivid life of this woman who is, I think, married and divorced 4 times because she is a Japanese woman living in Edo period. But eventually,
did they call it Batsuyon back then?
I don't think so. But although stigma did, came along with it. But she actually does make it out to sort of strike her own path and goes to Edo. Which is, the largest city in Japan, and in fact, one of the largest city by population in the world, period, at that time. And, tries to strike her own path, suffers, but eventually finds a man that she chooses on her own to marry, who she is with when she dies. And it's this sort of really dramatic life of an otherwise obscure woman, but it's a super great introduction to what Edo, the city, was like, what actually it felt like to live and breathe and smell the food and walk the streets and get robbed and et cetera, et cetera. So, I highly recommend Amy Stanley's Stranger in the Shogun City.
That sounds really, really good. This is a super basic question, but for someone like me who's come over from a different country and who's lived here more than a decade and still doesn't know a whole lot about the history of the country, do you think that I'd stand to benefit, or do you think it's even kind of kind of arrogant of me to be here and not know as much of the history? Do you think I'd have a different perspective if I knew more about it?
I think you'll definitely stand to benefit, just in terms of the pleasure of thinking about or realizing that the places that you're walking where you are, even in Kyushu, has these hundreds and thousands of years of rich history and layers, some of whose remains you might actually find. And to be fair, I think, your most average Japanese don't know much about the history of their own country, notoriously, like as in America, public school, education system only teaches you so much and only at the surface level. And, it's really only after I became a historian of Japan that, I walked around Tokyo and realized, wow, there's just so much of history still left in the very way in which the city is organized, the way some neighborhoods, streets are lined up. When did it happen that, the canals around Tokyo got covered by highways and concrete and things like that, when apparently it used to be called the Venice of the East. So I think I think there's a lot to be enjoyed and pleasure to taken out of learning about the past of where you are.
But it's about learning what aspect of it, right? Because it's like, Bobby's question was basically asking for permission for his ignorance, and I think you granted it. But it's just like in the UK, you don't get a richer history of London by like knowing that the relationship between Henry VII and Henry VIII. But you definitely get to understand how London was created by looking at like the various interests of the various political parties in the early 1900s and how they were interested in commerce and how that affected the railways and things like that. So it definitely obviously affects like what you study. And what I found interesting about your research background is that you look at the relationship between politics and art and how what you call them the elite members of Japan or something like that, the ruling elite, and how they integrate worldwide. Art is obviously seen as a big cultural export of Japan, and we've had guests on the podcast before who talk about Japan's modern contribution to the world is that of digital art and whatnot. Is that something which Japan has leveraged historically more than other countries?
Oh my gosh, I know a little bit about this. I'm doing a translation project. I just want to brag that I know about Sanotsu Nitame's Japanism. And how he used it strategically to help kickstart Japan's industrial economy. But anyway,
now
Yeah.
Gosh,
One
I'm not totally
all right, I'm
ignorant.
going to show off that I know something. One of my favorite facts about Japanese history, which might not even be true, is the Prussian blue. You know, the thing that really deep, rich blue that we see in like Hokusai's prints.
Yeah.
Apparently, that came like really recently in Japanese history, and that was as a result of commerce rather than art. And it was like they could only get their hands on that color. So I just love stuff like this.
Yeah.
But anyway, I've had a little show off. Bobby's had a little show off. Shall we ask the expert to answer my question?
No, absolutely. I think that's always been part of, at least, I think many countries, but certainly Japan has been in the business of both exporting its kind of alt cultural and artistic traditions, even at the same time as it imported, from all over the world. And, I think it's really intriguing that when Japan, quote unquote, opens up in the middle of the 19th century, coincides with a period where there's a massive interest both in the United States and in Europe about all things Japanese, right? And that's where the term like Japanning, which I think refers to lacquerware, came up because Americans and Europeans were buying up Japanese urushinuri, lacquerware products, paintings, woodblock print copies, as Japanese merchants, realize, oh wow, these Westerners really love buying these things, right? And then they end up going all the way to France and inspiring Monet and other impressionists, but it's really not until after 1868 when the Meiji Restoration overthrows, the Tokugawa shogunate, and there's a kind of national shift in mindset of Japanese becoming increasingly really eager, right, to adopt and learn anything and everything Western, whether it's technology or the science or law, or for that matter, culture. And these Japanese young Japanese starts going overseas and actually experience American and European street life and art scene and music scene and theater for the first time, that they actually not only go there and realize that, oh, we can learn a lot of things, but they also, I think, start to take pleasure in what they see and hear and smell and taste, right? And of course, at this period, these are very limited, usually more politically elite families or people who are, sent by government to go overseas, who can actually consume these products and then take on these trappings of Western culture that they genuinely enjoy for themselves.
But it's fascinating that for all that you can kind of grandstand and theorize about, and obviously the Meiji Restoration was obviously more than that, right? The import of law and code and whatever. But sometimes it does come down to the fact that like some kid of some diplomat tried really nice bread and they were like, love this. And that kind of influences policy more, than any kind of planning done in a parliament. Far more of the world that we enjoy now is based on the incentives of people who are thinking only about themselves.
Yeah, and I think that they have a really usually they have a good way of rationalizing it for themselves and for others of why this is super important. And you see that you see that in music, right? So these former samurai or non-samurai elites go to overseas. They listen to the opera. They really enjoy it, and they come home convinced that real music, quote unquote, real serious music, is Western art music, what we would call classical music. Mm-hmm. That's the gold standard of what a good music is. And so they come back and then, some of them actually still have some affinity to indigenous domestic musical traditions, but a lot of them also feel like, oh, these are kind of icky. These are, this feels either old-fashioned or this is below me. In fact, Kikawa, who I was talking about earlier, this young student who studies in Boston, talks in his autobiography about how in the American school that he attended in Boston, the only class that he absolutely hated, and he and his fellow Japanese students asked a teacher, pleaded with them not to make them take the class, was the music class and dancing class. And that was because for them, it was not something that was appropriate, at least for that particular people.
Yeah, well, let's jump into the news so we can discuss how Princess Mako's inevitable discovery of Cardi B's oeuvre will affect Japan's geopolitics for the next 100 years. Bobby, just before we do so, we need to say thanks to Tim, who bought us 5 coffees, saying, as Ollie cancelled an Edinburgh show, that's way more than and one, I was supposed to attend. Oh, yeah, I did cancel a show he was supposed to attend. I'll pass the ticket refund back your way. That's very nice. I knew the energetic dancing at the start of each performance would eventually catch up with him. That it did. Tim, thank you very much for sending this money on a weird paper trail back. The only real beneficiaries have been the fringe ticket office who have taken their commission and buy me a coffee. You haven't seen a show. I haven't managed to perform the show for you, but we're very grateful that you've sent the money our way. Thank you very much, Tim. Bobby, shall we jump into the news? Bobby Judah, what's in the news this week?
Well, the rumors have been confirmed. Princess Mako will marry her boyfriend this year and move to New York. Hiromu, Ali, and I know about as much about the Imperial family as the average Japanese person, so nothing. Why is this a big deal, and why are nationalists so angry about it?
Yeah, great question. So this controversy has been brewing since the fall of 2017, when Princess Mako, who is the daughter of now current Crown Prince Akishino, announced that she was going to be engaged to her college sweetheart, a man named Komuro Kei. They both attended the International Christian University in Mitaka, Tokyo, and so they announced that marriage, they announced the engagement, but within 2 or 3 months, tabloidy magazines and newspapers started digging up on the background of Komuro Kei, and specifically his mother.
Yeah, I remember this. There was so much mudslinging. A question about some debts of his mother's, right?
Yeah, so the allegation is that his mother was engaged to marry to a man, and that while they were engaged, that this man, who was apparently wealthy, financially supported them. And when the engagement was called off, he asked the money back from Komuro Kei's mother, and that they refused. That's the story that the former fiance has told the tabloids, and the tabloids have run with it. And so now they've labeled Komuro Kei as his mother as sort of, people who are refusing to pay their debts and who are plotting to, marry into the imperial family and run off with one of their daughters to New York. I think the truth is something quite different, but that's at least how the tabloids are reporting it.
And does this tie into the headlines which hit this week about how, depending on where you get it from, how Princess Mako has snubbed the handout by the Japanese government to start her new non-royal life? Is this to kind of show that she's doing it with clean hands?
So yeah, that's actually because I think they're exploring the idea that of declining this one-time lump sum money that any marrying royal daughters would typically get, right? Money that's that goes up to something like 150 million yen, just under 1.4 million US dollars. It's a lump sum. They usually get that amount. But the reason why I think Princess Mako and people around her are floating this idea of declining it is in order to try to placate the public opinion or any kind of backlash. In a context where her fiancé is accused of having these shady financial dealings, from Komuro Kei and his mother's perspective, as he's actually sort of spoken out and written publicized statements at least twice. The second one being a 28-pager that came out, I think, in April of 2020 or April of 2021, actually. And in it, he details sort of from his perspective how, the understanding was that this was always just a gift. It was never a loan, and it was only a year or two after his mother's engagement was called off that the former fiance suddenly demanded a repayment. They said no, and he went away. And it was only after his engagement to Princess Mako was announced that suddenly that former fiance started showing up and talking to the tabloids again. That's their side of the story.
Should we just dial back a little bit just to make sure that people who, like me, came into this absolutely ignorant? Can we quickly talk about the succession and who Princess Mako is in relation to the rest of the royal family and whether she was ever going to be in power?
Absolutely.
I think you answered your own question when you said she was ever going to be in power.
Yeah.
Well, exactly.
I mean, the imperial household law is very clear, right? That the succession to the imperial throne is only open and available to a male heir. And so this is why her father, Prince Akishino, who was the younger brother to the current emperor, and so who, while their father was on the throne until very recently, was not, was only second in line to the throne, now is actually Princess Mako's father is actually now the crown prince, first in line to the throne. And so on the one hand, Princess Mako herself is in no danger of becoming an emperor or an empress from certain perspective. Her father is very, very close, right, to becoming an emperor. And so I think from a more conservative, nationalistic perspective, that values the dignity of the imperial household above all things, she is actually a very important figure who should not be sort of sullied by gossips and scandals. And her ranking as a princess, not all imperial princes are equal. Actually, she is a Naishin no, or a princess of the blood. So someone who is within 2 degrees of relation to the reigning monarch. She was the granddaughter of the previous emperor. Now she is the niece of the current emperor. And so she is sort of on the very top tier of a Japanese princess, as it were.
And we should also mention that her grandfather abdicating the throne was an unprecedented thing to abdicate and to kind of like retire from being the emperor without dying was also kind of a huge shakeup.
Yeah, and that process was somewhat controversial too, because the Japanese imperial household is constitutionally, intentionally extremely confined, right, in what they are able to do. For example, they literally do not have private property, unlike the British royals, right? The Constitution says that all imperial property is state property, and we will give them everything they need. And so there is no Duchy of Lancaster, for example, like Queen Elizabeth has. And they are also not supposed to get involved in politics or in policy making.
This is a point that I wanted to bring up, and again, this will kind of illustrate my ignorance of Japanese history. But whereas other monarchs, other royal families, historically, kind of like there were early historical periods where they wielded real power and real authority, I kind of have the sense that, with a few exceptions, from the very beginning, that the Japanese imperial family were always ceremonial figureheads.
Yeah, and I think, we could emphasize it a little bit too hard. It's not that different members of the imperial household didn't have or wield political influence. So, during the Heian period, for example, the 10th century, 9th century, the reigning emperor really did not rule the country in his or her own will. But it was actually his or her father, the former emperor, the retired emperor, who actually wielded power behind the scenes. And later on, it was the officials of the various shogunate, the warrior governments, and into the modern era, it is really the state bureaucracy and eventually the politicians who actually wield political power. It's not to say, though, right, that emperors actually never had, even in the modern era, any kind of political influence. Emperor Hirohito, for example, historians have talked about how he was both on some level culpable in Japan's expansionism and encouraging some aspects of it. And then later on, he was actually seen to be one of the people who was trying to put the brakes on Japanese military sort of, expansionism, especially around the time of the Second World War. So it's not that they don't have any kind of political power, but it's that in the post-World War II context, under the post-war constitution, the emperor is really not supposed to sway policy decisions. And in the case of the retirement, it is a state policy decision. And so I think even historians who are sympathetic to the emperor's sort of personal plight have noted some anxiety about, well, what does this mean when the emperor can try to influence and wield government policy and legislation, because it needed a legislation to let him retire. What does it mean for the reigning Japanese symbol monarch to, make his feelings known in a way that actually sways the prime minister? And even, the point that Ollie made earlier actually about the Princess Mako potentially declining the one-time lump sum is actually controversial precisely for that point, because that money is actually decided on by a committee that is headed by the prime minister. And the speakers of the lower and upper houses of the Japanese parliament. And so for the palace to kind of leak out feelers about, well, maybe if we decline this lump sum, people will be, less angry about the marriage. I've seen historians say that, this feels like we're getting into another iffy legal territory where a member of the imperial household is potentially swaying a decision of a committee headed by the prime minister.
So what's the scandal then? Is the risk that Mako can, once she gets married, she's going to get rid of her royal status because of some rules that I don't really understand about who she's marrying, and that she'll, I don't know, become Americanized, and then she'll actually have more ability to criticize the government by virtue of the fact that she's no longer got royal status? Is that the worst case scenario for people that are against her?
Yeah, I think so. From the reason why some of the most vocal critics, at least on the Japanese media and talking heads and pundits, I think the most vociferous critics do tend to come from a more nationalistic, conservative-minded perspective. People who really see the imperial household and the emperor, but also their families as a kind of linchpin of Japan's nationhood. That if we tamper with this institution, we are going to, go down the slippery slope of a nation breaking down. And so from that kind of perspective, right, an ideal way for Mako to be married is to marry someone who has zero controversy, who is preferably from one of the older families, right? Like members of the former aristocracy, or one of the people who runs major shrines around Japan. And because these are the people that Japanese royal daughters tend to get married to even now. Or, a good salaryman, right? The fact that she's marrying someone who fairly or unfairly has been labeled as having shady financial dealings, who dared to study abroad and is now daring to start a career abroad and to take a royal daughter with him, is, I think, on that in itself is scandalous and enough. And then they come up with all kinds of reasons. Well, the security cost is going to be so expensive. What if somebody attacks her? What if they do something?
This is America. There's no what if.
Right.
It's also very, very typical of the way that Japan thinks about America. I remember having conversations with Japanese people who were like, well, I'd like to visit America, but I also don't want to get shot.
Yeah. And, but I think also there's a recent example of Meghan Markle and Princess Harry is in the minds of people, right? Of these royals who strike out and start talking. Because I think it is true that compared to other royal daughters who married previously, and by law, they lose their royal status when they married, which, some people think, I think some people have thought of it as a sexist thing. And I do think there is sexism in that law. But it's also true, and it's worth thinking that Princess Mako is likely going to be one of the freest former imperial princesses by becoming a commoner, because now she can actually have private property. And now she's going to be overseas, and no other former princesses have done that.
Bobby, we're calling it now. They turned down that $1.3 million because they're going to get an equivalent Spotify deal. Hey, thanks very much for listening to this episode 98 of Japan by River Cruise. We have a new show every single Friday. We look forward to seeing you this time next week.
And thank you to our guest this week, Hiromu Nagahara. Hiromu, it was really a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It was so much fun. And if the listeners want to follow me on Twitter at Hiromu Nagahara, I promise I will dole out some more random royal trivias.
Thank you. And we'll see you next week.